The Arizona desert knew Joaquin Santos by the sound of his spurs, a slow, deliberate rhythm that announced death walking through a landscape already bleached white by violence and regret. At 63, he carried his reputation like a curse that followed him across territories where his name was whispered in saloons and spoken in churches as proof that some men fell so far from grace that redemption became a luxury they could no longer afford. The scars that mapped his weathered face told stories of 27 gunfights, 14 knife wounds, and one hanging that failed only because the rope had frayed at the critical moment. Each mark was a reminder of choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but had accumulated into something that made mirrors dangerous and sleep impossible. He was dust and gunpowder, shadow and regret, a man who'd outlived every friendship and buried every chance at the kind of life that left monuments instead of cautionary tales. His camp that night sat in a fold of rock and sage 30 miles from the nearest settlement, chosen not for comfort, but for the kind of defensible isolation that kept curious lawmen and ambitious bounty hunters at a respectful distance. The fire he built was small and smokeless, feeding on dry wood that burned clean and left no trace for trackers who might be following his trail across country that had learned to expect violence from men who carry their homes in saddlebags and their histories in the worn grips of well-used weapons. The coffee he brewed was strong enough to wake the dead, black as the desert night and bitter with the taste of loneliness that had become his only constant companion. He drank it from a tin cup that had seen better decades, listening to familiar sounds of the desert settling into darkness, the distant call of a coyote testing the wind, the rustle of something small moving through brush that offered concealment to creatures that understood survival meant staying invisible. The cold came early that night, dropping from clear skies with a sudden violence that marked desert weather in late autumn. Joaquin pulled his poncho closer, feeling the bite of air that could freeze a man's blood in his veins if he was careless about staying warm. It was a kind of cold that killed thoughtlessly, without malice but with the casual efficiency of a landscape that had no patience for weakness or poor judgment. He was reaching for more wood to feed his fire when he heard it, a sound so soft it might have been imagination, if Joaquin hadn't learned to trust his ears more than his eyes in country, where hearing trouble before it became visible was often the difference between living to see another sunrise and becoming food for buzzards. Footsteps, light and careful, approaching from the darkness beyond his fire's glow. Not the heavy tread of men looking for trouble, but something else entirely. The barely audible whisper of bare feet moving across sand with the kind of practiced stealth that spoke of people who'd learned that survival often depended on not being noticed. Joaquin's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but he didn't draw the weapon. Instead, he remained perfectly still, listening as the footsteps circled his camp at a respectful distance, neither approaching nor retreating, as if their owner was trying to decide whether the man by the fire represented safety or another kind of danger to add to whatever had driven him into the desert darkness. She appeared at the edge of his firelight like a spirit taking physical form, a young native woman whose presence was so unexpected that for a moment Joaquin wondered if the desert solitude had finally driven him to seeing things that existed only in the guilty corners of his imagination. But she was real enough, Apache, by the look of her traditional dress and the way she moved through the landscape like she'd been born from it, perhaps 20 years old, wearing clothes that spoke of someone who'd been traveling hard across country that didn't forgive mistakes or hesitation. Her long black hair hung loose around shoulders that carried themselves with a kind of dignity that couldn't be taught or assumed, only earned through experiences that had burned away everything superficial and left behind something essentially true. But it was her condition that made Joaquin's weathered heart contract with unexpected recognition. Her face was burned by sun and wind, marked by the kind of exposure that came from days of traveling without adequate shelter. Her feet were bare and bloody, speaking of someone who'd been walking across the rain that challenged seasoned travelers wearing proper boots. Most telling of all, she carried herself with the careful stillness of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of endurance and was operating on willpower alone. She stood at the edge of his firelight without speaking, her dark eyes holding depths of exhaustion and wariness that reminded Joaquin why he'd learned to be careful about making assumptions about what people needed or wanted from him. There was pride there, the kind that would let a person die rather than beg for help from strangers who might demand prices that dignity couldn't afford to pay. For a long moment, they studied each other across the distance that separated them. The aging gunfighter whose reputation had made him a legend that parents used to frighten children into obedience, and a young woman whose presence at his camp raised questions that had no safe answers in country, where Apache people were often seen as threats rather than human beings deserving of basic consideration. Joaquin had killed Apache warriors in fair fights and unfair ones, had been party to the kind of frontier justice that made newspapers and created the mythology of the Wild West. He had every reason to see her as an enemy, and she had every reason to see him as the kind of white man who represented everything that had gone wrong in the relationship between their peoples. Instead, what Joaquin saw was exhaustion that reminded him of his own weariness, vulnerability that echoed the isolation he'd carried for more years than he cared to count, and a dignity that demanded respect regardless of the color of skin or the history of violence that had brought them to this moment. Without speaking, without offering explanations that might have been lies anyway, Joaquin pulled his poncho from his shoulders and extended half of it toward her, not as charity that might wound her pride, but as a simple acknowledgement that the cold was universal and warmth was something that could be shared between human beings without requiring justification or creating obligations that neither could afford. She approached slowly, her movements carrying the fluid caution of someone who'd been taught to read danger in the smallest gestures, to calculate escape routes even while accepting help. When she settled beside his fire, careful to maintain distance that preserved both their dignities, Joaquin felt something shift in his chest that he thought was dead and buried along with whatever conscience he'd possessed before the world taught him that mercy was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford. They sat together in silence, sharing warmth and firelight while the desert cold pressed against them like something alive and hungry. Neither spoke, but their shared stillness carried the weight of understanding that sometimes the most important communications happen without words, that some kind of help are best offered and accepted in the language of simple human decency that transcended the boundaries between peoples who'd learned to see each other as enemies. The night deepened around them like water finding its level, bringing with it the kind of silence that made small sounds carry for miles and turned shadows into mysteries that could conceal both salvation and destruction. Joaquin fed the fire with careful attention, maintaining the delicate balance between warmth and concealment that could mean the difference between survival and discovery by those who might be hunting either of them across the desert. The young woman beside him remained motionless, her breathing shallow but steady as she gradually allowed exhaustion to claim territory that adrenaline had been defending for what might have been days. Joaquin found himself watching her with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for reading weather patterns or tracking signs that might indicate approaching trouble. She was beautiful in a way that weathered stone was beautiful, marked by hardship but possessing a strength that suggested she could endure whatever storms might come. Her face showed the high cheekbones and strong features that marked her Apache heritage, but it was her eyes that held Joaquin's attention when she occasionally glanced in his direction. Dark brown, almost black, holding depths of intelligence and pain that reminded him why he'd learned to be careful about looking too closely at other people's suffering. The cold bit deeper as midnight approached, and Joaquin could see her fighting to suppress shivers that spoke of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its normal limits. Without asking permission that might have forced her to choose between pride and comfort, he shifted the poncho to provide better coverage for both of them, the movement casual enough to preserve the fiction that he was adjusting his own position rather than offering additional protection. She accepted the gesture with the kind of subtle nod that acknowledged his consideration without making it seem like charity that required gratitude. It was a grace note in the complex symphony of unspoken communication that had developed between them, proof that dignity could survive even in circumstances that stripped away everything except the most essential human qualities. Water, Joaquin said quietly, offering his canteen without making the gesture seem like an interrogation about her condition or a demand for explanation about what had brought her to his fire. She accepted the water with careful control, drinking only what she needed despite what was obviously considerable thirst. Apache training, Joaquin realized, learning to ration resources because survival in harsh country meant understanding that today's excess could mean tomorrow's death. Food, he added, pulling jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags and setting them within her reach. Not much, but it'll keep you alive until you figure out where you're supposed to be. She ate slowly, making the meager rations last while she continued to study him with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Joaquin understood the calculation she was performing. weighing the risk of trusting a stranger whose reputation preceded him into every settlement and saloon across the territory against the desperation that had brought her to accept help from someone who had every reason to be considered dangerous. "You know who I am," Joaquin said finally, not a question but a statement that acknowledged the reality that his face was probably as familiar to her as it was to every lawman and bounty hunter between El Paso and San Francisco. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. "Joaquin Santos," she said, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone speaking a name that had been whispered in her presence often enough to become familiar. "The one they call Death Shadow." "And you're not afraid," Joaquin observed, noting the way she maintained eye contact despite knowing exactly who she was sharing fire with. "Fear is a luxury," she replied with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned that survival often required setting aside emotions that might interfere with clear thinking. "You could have killed me the moment I appeared at your fire. Instead, you shared your warmth and food. Actions matter more than reputation when a person is dying of cold." They fell into comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about the strange circumstances that brought them together in a desert camp, where two people who should have been enemies were instead sharing the kind of basic human consideration that seemed increasingly rare in a world that rewarded violence over mercy. "What are you running from?" Joaquin asked when the fire had burned low enough to require more wood. The question hung in the cold air between them, carrying weight that both understood. She could lie, could deflect, could maintain the kind of privacy that people like them learned to value above almost everything else. Or she could trust him with truth that might be more dangerous than any weapon he carried. "Soldiers," she said finally, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd learned that some truths were too important to dress up in comfortable lies. "They came to our camp 3 days ago, said we were off the reservation without permission, that we needed to return immediately for our own safety." Joaquin felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what she was describing. He'd heard enough stories from other Apache to recognize the pattern. Safety that looked suspiciously like imprisonment, protection that resembled elimination, and relocation that meant the end of communities that had existed for generations. "Your family?" he asked gently. "Scattered. My father told everyone to run in different directions, to meet at the old place when the soldiers stopped looking." Her voice remained steady, but Joaquin caught the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of losses too fresh to touch directly. "I don't know how many made it out. And you've been walking for 3 days. Running mostly. Hiding when I had to. The soldiers have trackers, men who know how to follow Apache through country we've traveled since childhood." She looked directly at him, her expression carrying a mixture of exhaustion and determination that reminded Joaquin why Apache people had earned the respect of every military commander who'd ever faced him in battle. "I thought I'd lost them yesterday, but tracks don't lie. They're still following." Joaquin absorbed this information, understanding that harboring a fugitive Apache woman would put him in direct conflict with territorial authorities who were already looking for excuses to eliminate problems they couldn't solve through conventional means. But looking at her face in the firelight, seeing the courage it had taken to approach a stranger's camp when discovery might mean death, he felt something stirring in his chest that he thought was dead and buried along with whatever conscience he'd once possessed. "How close?" he asked. "Close enough that they'll find this camp before noon tomorrow if they maintain their current pace," she replied with a matter-of-fact assessment of someone who'd been calculating survival odds for 3 days straight. "Then we'd better make sure they find something that doesn't tell them what they're looking for," Joaquin said, reaching for his rifle with movements that spoke of someone who'd made similar decisions many times before, usually with results that left more graves than survivors. As they settled in for what remained of the night, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to rest, Joaquin found himself thinking about redemption and the strange paths that led men from one kind of life to another. 24 hours ago, he'd been a drifter whose greatest concern was staying ahead of his own reputation. Now he was apparently preparing to take on the U.S. Army in defense of someone whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't the life he'd planned or the death he'd expected, but something about the young woman who'd appeared at his fire like an answer to prayers he'd never thought to pray made him believe that maybe some purposes were worth the risks they demanded. The soldiers appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its climb over the eastern mountains. Their dust cloud, visible long before the individual riders, could be distinguished from the heat shimmer that rose from sand already warming under the merciless Arizona sky. Joaquin counted them through his field glasses. A patrol of 20 men led by a young lieutenant whose spotless uniform and rigid posture suggested someone more familiar with military manuals than the practical realities of tracking Apache through country that could kill inexperienced soldiers as efficiently as any enemy action. "They're coming hard," Joaquin observed, noting the way the patrol maintained formation despite the challenging terrain. Probably been riding since before dawn. The young woman, who'd told him her name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in her grandmother's tongue, watched the approaching soldiers with the calm attention of someone who'd learned to face inevitable danger without wasting energy on fear or regret. 20 men, she said, echoing his count, against one aging gunfighter and one exhausted Apache woman. They probably consider this an easy capture. Probably, Joaquin agreed, checking his weapons with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on having more bullets than the other side had optimism. Question is whether they're planning to take you back alive, or whether they decided that dead Apache don't cause bureaucratic complications. Ayana's expression darkened as she considered possibilities that both of them understood, but neither wanted to speak aloud. Military patrols operating far from oversight sometimes made decisions about frontier justice that would never appear in official reports, and Apache women traveling alone were often seen as problems that could be solved permanently without generating the kind of political consequences that came from actions taken against men or larger groups. "What do you suggest?" she asked, understanding that his experience with violence made him the logical leader in their two-person war council. "I suggest we remind them that easy captures sometimes turn expensive when the people being captured decide they'd rather go down fighting," Joaquin replied, positioning himself behind the largest boulder in their impromptu defensive position. "And I suggest we make it clear that anyone who wants to harm you is going to have to go through me first." What followed was a conversation conducted in the universal language of gunfire and tactical positioning, as 20 soldiers discovered that capturing one Apache woman was considerably more complicated when she was protected by someone whose reputation for competence with firearms had been earned through 40 years of surviving encounters that had killed men with less experience and worse judgment. Joaquin's opening shot dropped the lieutenant's horse at 800 yards, a display of marksmanship that caused the entire patrol to reconsider their assumptions about the difficulty of their assignment. His second shot took the hat off Sergeant Morrison, sending a message about accuracy that made further conversation unnecessary for men who understood that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford when facing someone who would kill them before they got close enough to return fire effectively. "You're good," Ayana observed, watching him work the lever of his rifle with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "I'm old," Joaquin corrected, sending another round close enough to a trooper's position to make the man reconsider his commitment to military service. Old and mean and tired people who think badges give them the right to hunt human beings for sport. The soldier's response was predictable but ineffective, a frontal assault that might have worked against inexperienced offenders, but which foundered against a combination of superior position, accurate shooting, and the kind of tactical patience that came from someone who'd learned that winning gunfights was more about not losing them than about demonstrating courage through dramatic gestures. By noon, the patrol had withdrawn to a respectful distance, their enthusiasm for immediate action considerably dampened by casualties that included 3 wounded men, and the growing realization that they were facing someone whose competence exceeded anything their training had prepared them to handle. "They'll be back," Ayana said as they watched the soldiers establish a camp that put them beyond effective rifle range while maintaining visual contact with the position they'd failed to overrun. "With reinforcements," Joaquin agreed. "Probably 50 men, maybe more. Enough firepower to make our little fort here untenable regardless of how good our shooting might be. Then we should leave." "We should," Joaquin acknowledged. "But leaving means traveling across open ground where cavalry can run us down, fighting a running battle against odds that get worse every hour we stay ahead of them." Ayana studied his face, reading something there that made her expression shift from tactical calculation to something approaching wonder. "You're not planning to run, are you?" "I'm planning to give you time to reach your people," Joaquin said, checking his ammunition supply with movements that spoke of someone making final preparations rather than temporary adjustments. One man with good position and plenty of bullets can hold off a lot of soldiers for a long time, especially those soldiers are more interested in avoiding casualties than in achieving objectives. You would die for someone you met 12 hours ago. I would die for the principle that some things are worth protecting regardless of who's doing protecting or who needs a protection. Joaquin replied with a kind of certainty that came from someone who'd finally found a cause that justified the risks it demanded. Besides, I've been looking for a good death for 20 years. This one seems better than most. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the desert landscape, and the distant dust cloud announced the arrival of military reinforcements that would transform their defensive position from difficult to impossible, Ayanna made a decision that surprised both of them. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "You have to leave. That's the point of this whole exercise." "The point of this exercise is that you saw someone who needed help and chose to provide it despite the cost to yourself," Ayanna corrected. "Well, now I see someone who needs help, and I'm choosing to provide it despite the cost of myself." Joaquin looked at her with expressions that cycled through surprise, admiration, and something that might have been the first genuine affection he'd felt for another human being in more years than he cared to count. "You know this is probably suicide." "I know this is probably the most important thing either of us will ever do," Ayanna replied. "And I know that dying beside someone who chose to protect me seems better than living with the knowledge that I abandoned someone who chose to protect me." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains and the sound of many horses announced the arrival of forces that would test their resolve in ways neither had imagined when the day began, Joaquin Santos found himself thinking about legacy and the strange ways that individual choices could echo across time in patterns that no one could predict or control. He'd spent 40 years building a reputation based on fear and violence, had become the kind of man whose name was used to frighten children and whose presence made decent people cross streets to avoid unwanted contact. Now, in what would probably be his final hours, he discovered that redemption might be possible for anyone brave enough to choose protection over self-preservation, even when that choice led inevitably toward a grave that would probably remain unmarked in desert sand that had already swallowed the bones of countless other men who'd made similar decisions for similar reasons. But looking at Ayanna's face as she prepared to make her own stand against overwhelming odds, Joaquin felt something approaching peace with whatever judgment might be rendered by forces larger than military tribunals or territorial courts. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of whether they could be won, and some companionship was worth dying for regardless of how briefly it had been enjoyed. The reinforcements arrived with the dust and heat of late afternoon, a column of cavalry that stretched across the desert horizon like a dark line drawn between earth and sky. Joaquin counted them through his field glasses, 80 men, maybe more, representing enough firepower to reduce his defensive position to rubble within minutes if they chose to press their attack with the kind of coordinated assault that military training made possible. "That's a lot of soldiers for two people," Ayanna observed, watching the newcomers establish positions that would allow them to bring overwhelming force to bear on the boulder field that had become their unlikely fortress. "That's a lot of soldiers for anyone," Joaquin agreed, noting how the cavalry commander, a major whose confident bearing suggested considerable experience with frontier warfare, was deploying his forces with the methodical precision of someone who understood that patience and superior numbers would accomplish what immediate assault had failed to achieve. "Your reputation precedes you," Ayanna said, reading the respect in the soldiers' movements, the careful attention they paid to maintaining distance, and cover that spoke of men who'd heard stories about what happened to people who underestimated aging gunfighters with nothing left to lose. "Reputation's a funny thing," Joaquin mused, checking his rifle for what might be the final time. "Spend 40 years building it through actions you're not proud of, then discover it's most useful when you're finally doing something worth being proud of." The afternoon stretched toward evening with the kind of oppressive tension that preceded thunderstorms, all pressure and electricity building towards something that everyone could feel but no one could predict. The soldiers maintained their positions without advancing, content to wait for whatever orders their commander was contemplating, while Joaquin and Ayanna prepared for what seemed like an inevitable conclusion to their unlikely partnership. "Tell me about your people," Joaquin said as they shared water and the last of his food, understanding that conversation might be the only legacy either of them would leave behind. "Tell me what's worth dying to protect." Ayanna's voice took on the cadence of someone who'd been raised on stories passed down through generations, tales that carried the weight of cultural memory and the responsibility of preserving wisdom that existed nowhere except in the minds of people who understood their value. "We are the desert people," she said, her words painting pictures of communities that had learned to thrive in landscapes that killed others, of traditions that connected human existence to the larger rhythms of earth and sky, and the endless cycles that governed all living things. "We understand that survival requires harmony rather than conquest, that strength comes from adaptation rather than domination." "Sounds like wisdom the rest of us could use," Joaquin observed. "Wisdom that's being destroyed by people who think understanding can be replaced by control," Ayanna replied, her voice carrying the pain of someone who'd watched entire communities scattered by policies that treated human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than people whose knowledge might be valuable to everyone. As evening settled over the desert and cooking fires began to appear in the cavalry camp, Joaquin found himself thinking about the strange mathematics of sacrifice and significance, about how individual choices could matter more than anyone realized when they were being made. Tomorrow would probably bring his death and Ayanna's capture, but tonight, listening to her stories about people who'd learned to live in harmony with country that challenged every assumption about what survival required, he felt something approaching satisfaction with the path that had led him to this moment. "Do you regret it?" Ayanna asked as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Choosing to help someone who brought soldiers and probable death to your peaceful camp? I regret that it took me 63 years to find something worth helping," Joaquin replied honestly. "I regret that I spent so many years being the kind of man people needed protection from instead of the kind of man who provided protection. And now I get to find out whether it's possible to balance 40 years of wrong choices with one right one," Joaquin said, settling against a boulder that would serve as his final defensive position. "Seems like better odd than I deserved." They kept watch through the night, taking turns sleeping while the other monitored the cavalry positions that surrounded them like a noose that could be tightened at any moment. But something was happening in the darkness beyond their sight, something that neither the soldiers nor their intended targets could detect, but which was transforming the tactical situation in ways that would become apparent only when morning arrived with its harsh revelations. The desert was no longer empty. Eyes watched from concealment that had been perfected over generations of avoiding detection by enemies who possessed superior numbers and firepower, but who never quite learned to read the landscape with the kind of attention that made the difference between hunting and being hunted. Messages traveled through the night on wind and starlight, carried by people who understood communication methods that had been ancient when the first Spanish explorers stumbled across territories they would never truly comprehend. Word spread about the old gunfighter who'd chosen to protect an Apache woman against impossible odds, about two people who decided that some principles were worth dying for regardless of whether dying would serve any practical purpose. By dawn, the careful balance of power that had seemed so clearly established would be permanently altered by forces that had been gathering in the darkness, drawn by respect for courage that transcended the artificial boundaries between peoples who shared the same harsh but beautiful land. The cavalry would discover that 80 soldiers, however well-trained and well-armed, were insufficient when facing opponents who understood warfare in ways that military manuals had never quite managed to capture. But for now, in the peaceful hours before sunrise, Joaquin Santos and Ayanna sat together under stars that seemed close enough to touch, sharing stories in silence while preparing to discover whether individual acts of decency could inspire collective responses that would echo across time in ways that no one could predict or control. The desert held its breath, waiting for dawn to reveal what the darkness had been quietly arranging while soldiers slept and two unlikely allies prepared to make their final stand against odds that no reasonable person would have chosen to face. But reasonableness, as both of them had learned, was often the enemy of the kind of courage that actually mattered when everything important was at stake. Dawn came slowly to the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, while the temperature began its daily climb toward the kind of heat that made sensible creatures seek shade and made desperate ones do remarkable things. Joaquin woke to silence, not the natural quiet of desert morning, but something deeper and more significant, the kind of stillness that spoke of many people maintaining perfect discipline while they positioned themselves for actions that would reshape everything about the situation that had seemed so clearly defined the night before. "They're here," Ayanna whispered, her voice carrying across the space between sleep and wakefulness with the clarity of someone who'd been trained from childhood to read signs that others might miss. Joaquin's eyes opened to a sight that would remain etched in his memory for whatever time remained to him. Warriors. Not dozens, but hundreds, mounted on horses that moved across the broken ground with liquid silence that defied everything he thought he knew about the relationship between large groups and concealment. They flowed around the cavalry positions like water around stones, appearing from landscape that had seemed empty moments before, demonstrating the kind of tactical superiority that came from people who'd been fighting on this ground since long before anyone had thought to call it Arizona territory. At their center rode a figure that commanded immediate respect. An older man whose bearing spoke of natural authority earned through decisions that had kept his people alive during impossible times. His war paint was elaborate but not hostile, decorated with symbols that Joaquin couldn't read but somehow understood as belonging to ceremony rather than battle preparation. 500, Ayanna breathed, counting warriors whose presence transformed the tactical situation from impossible to merely complex. Maybe more, every band within 3 days' ride, united under my father's leadership. Joaquin felt something shift in his understanding as pieces clicked together like the mechanism of a well-made watch. Your father, Chief Standing Bearer of the Chiricahua Apache, Ayanna confirmed, pride and love evident in her voice despite the circumstances that had brought this confrontation to his desert camp. He who never forgets kindness shown to his people, never ignores threats made against his children. The cavalry major who'd been so confident the night before now found himself facing a situation that no military manual had prepared him to handle. 80 soldiers, however well-trained, were suddenly insufficient when confronting a force that outnumbered them 6-1 and held every advantage that came from superior knowledge of terrain, weather, and the kind of warfare that frontiersmen had never quite learned to counter effectively. Chief Standing Bear urged his horse forward, approaching the no-man's land between opposing forces with the deliberate dignity of someone conducting important business that would be remembered and retold for generations. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the desert air, clear and strong and filled with the kind of authority that didn't need badges or rank to command respect. I am Standing Bear, he announced, his English precise despite the accent that marked it as a carefully learned second language. I have come for my daughter and for the man who protected her when protection was needed. The major, whose name Joaquin had learned was Patterson, found his voice despite the obvious strain of commanding forces that had suddenly become inadequate for their assigned mission. Sir, we're operating under orders from Territorial Command. The woman is wanted for questioning regarding activities off the reservation. My daughter has broken no laws, Standing Bear replied with the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to children. She was traveling legally on land guaranteed to our people by treaties your government signed and swore to honor. Treaties that may have been superseded by more recent policy directives, Patterson said, but his voice lacked conviction as he spoke words that sounded hollow even to him. Policies, Standing Bear repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Policies change with the wind. Honor endures like the mountains. The man behind those rocks chose honor when he could have chosen safety. For this, he has earned something that cannot be taken by force or diminished by policy. The chief gestured toward his warriors, and what happened next will be talked about in frontier saloons and military academies for decades to come. 500 Apache fighters dismounted as one, each man moving with the fluid precision of long practice, as they knelt in the desert sand facing the boulder field, where Joaquin Santos had prepared to make his final stand. It was a gesture of respect so unprecedented that several of the cavalry troopers audibly gasped, their understanding of Apache culture insufficient to fully comprehend what they were witnessing, but adequate to recognize that something extraordinary was taking place in the morning heat of the Arizona desert. Rise, Joaquin Santos, Standing Bear commanded, his voice carrying across the distance with the authority of someone whose words could reshape the fundamental relationships between peoples who had learned to see each other as enemies. You who protected our daughter when you had no obligation to do so have earned a place of honor among the Apache people. Joaquin emerged from his defensive position slowly, acutely aware that he was participating in something that transcended individual survival or death, something that connected him to forces larger and more permanent than territorial politics or military campaigns. Ayanna walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that spoke of partnership forged in circumstances that had stripped away everything except the most essential human qualities. "Why?" Joaquin asked when he stood before the chief whose daughter he'd shared his fire with, when sharing meant risking everything he'd built during 63 years of careful survival. "Because you saw someone who needed help and chose to provide it despite the cost of yourself," Standing Bear replied. "Because you proved that some white men still remember what honor means, still understand that strength without compassion is merely cruelty with better weapons." Major Patterson, recognizing that his military situation had become untenable and his political position had become indefensible, made the only decision that offered hope of avoiding a massacre that would end his career and probably his life. "Stand down," he ordered his troops, understanding that discretion was not just a better part of valor, but the only part that would let him live to see another sunset. As the cavalry began their withdrawal, leaving behind a story that would challenge every assumption about Apache-white relations for years to come, Joaquin found himself thinking about transformation and the strange paths that led people from one kind of life to another. Yesterday, he'd been a drifter whose greatest concern was staying ahead of his own reputation. Now he was apparently a bridge between worlds. Someone whose simple act of human decency had proven that understanding was possible even between peoples who've been taught to see each other as natural enemies. "What happens now?" Joaquin asked as 500 warriors prepared to disappear back into landscape that would swallow them as completely as if they'd never existed. "Now you have a choice," Standing Bear said, his weathered face showing something that might have been the first genuine smile Joaquin had seen from him. "You can return to your old life, carrying with you the knowledge that you've earned the respect of people who don't give such recognition lightly. Or you can come with us, learn what it means to be part of something larger than individual survival." Joaquin looked at Ayanna, reading in her dark eyes an invitation that went beyond simple gratitude to something that resembled hope for futures neither had dared to imagine when they'd shared his fire and poncho in the cold desert night. "Well," Joaquin said, understanding that he was about to make the most important decision of a life that had included far too many wrong choices and not nearly enough right ones, "I've been looking for a good reason to change my name. Santos means saints, which never fit very well anyway.